Clara Voss raised her hand and struck Evelyn Grant across the face in front of 12 investors, 2 board members, and a husband who did nothing. The room went silent. Glasses stopped clinking. Forks froze midair. And in that single vicious second, a woman who had been invisible for 7 years finally decided she was done being quiet. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel. Follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The invitation had said 7 o'clock. By 6:55, every seat at the long mahogany table in the private dining room of the Sterling Club was filled except one, Evelyn Grant's seat. It wasn't that she was late. She had arrived at 6:40, slipped through the side entrance as she always did, spoken briefly with the maitre d', checked the placement cards, and then retreated to the powder room to compose herself. Not because she was nervous. Evelyn Grant had not been nervous in a very long time. She retreated because she had learned through years of careful observation that the less she was seen arriving, the more she was underestimated at the table. And being underestimated, she had discovered, was the most powerful position in any room. She smoothed the lapel of her navy blazer, checked her reflection once, not out of vanity, but out of discipline, and walked back toward the private dining room with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be and everywhere important to go. Nathan was already performing. That was the only word for it. Performing. He stood at the head of the table, jacket perfectly pressed, smile, perfectly calibrated voice, carrying just enough warmth to seem genuine, and just enough authority to seem unshakable. He was telling a story about the early days of Grant Capital, the version he always told at investor dinners, the one where he worked out of a 1-bedroom apartment and ate instant noodles and turned $40,000 into a company worth $260 million. It was a good story. It was even partially true. What the story left out, as it always did, was that the $40,000 had come from Evelyn's family trust, and that the first 3 investor introductions that built Grant Capital's foundation had come through her father's connections, and that when the company nearly collapsed in its 3rd year, it was Evelyn who had quietly made one phone call to one man at Hartwell Trust, and the crisis had dissolved overnight. But Nathan told the story without her in it. He always had. Evelyn pulled out her chair at the far end of the table, not beside Nathan, never beside Nathan at these dinners, because Clara had long ago arranged the seating so that she herself sat at Nathan's right hand and settled in quietly. A few guests glanced her way. One of the younger associates gave her a polite nod. Nobody introduced her. Nobody needed to. They already believed they knew exactly who she was. Nathan's wife, background figure, decorative presence, the woman who smiled and said nothing. Clara Voss caught Evelyn's arrival from across the table, and something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, not obviously, but Evelyn noticed it because Evelyn noticed everything. It was the particular tightening around Clara's mouth that happened whenever Evelyn entered a room Clara had already claimed. A fraction of a second of recalibration. Then the smile returned bright and practiced and aimed back at Nathan, who was finishing his story to appreciative laughter. Clara was 31 years old, efficient and surgically aware of her own attractiveness in professional settings. She had worked for Nathan for 4 years, and in those 4 years, she had systematically expanded her role from executive assistant to something that didn't have a clean title, but everyone in Grant Capital quietly understood. She managed his schedule, yes. She coordinated his investor communications, yes, but she also whispered in his ear at board meetings. She decided which calls he took and which he didn't. She had on 3 separate occasions that Evelyn knew of sent messages from Nathan's personal phone to associates' messages Nathan himself had not written, had not reviewed, and had not remembered sending. And Nathan let her. That was the thing Evelyn had spent the longest time trying to understand. Not that Clara had ambition. Ambition was ordinary. But that Nathan, a man who had built a company on the premise that he was in control of everything, had handed control of enormous swaths of his life to a 31-year-old assistant and seemed entirely unbothered by it. Or perhaps he wasn't unbothered. Perhaps he simply didn't see it as control being taken. Perhaps he experienced it as loyalty, competence, devotion. Men with Nathan's particular brand of ego often misread management as love. The first course arrived. seared scallops with a lemon beurre blanc that Evelyn had specifically requested from the kitchen 3 days ago when she'd called to confirm the reservation, a call Clara didn't know she'd made. The waiter moved around the table with practiced efficiency, and conversation resumed at a pleasant professional hum. Marcus Webb, the lead investor from Denner Capital, sat 2 seats down from Evelyn. He was 64, silver-haired, and had been in the investment world long enough to read rooms better than most therapists. He caught Evelyn's eye briefly and gave her a small, knowing nod. She returned it. They had met before years ago at a Hartwell Trust function that Nathan had not attended because Clara had scheduled a conflict. Marcus knew who Evelyn was, not Nathan's wife, not a background figure. Marcus knew exactly who Evelyn was, and the fact that he was sitting at this table tonight at this particular dinner was not a coincidence. Evelyn reached for her water glass and listened. "The Caldwell acquisition is the cornerstone," Nathan was saying, spreading his hands in a gesture of expansive confidence. "Once we close that, the portfolio structure shifts completely. We're looking at a 38% increase in managed assets within 18 months. "Conservative estimate?" asked one of the investors, a woman named Patricia Gould, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who ran a mid-sized fund out of Chicago. "Conservative," Nathan confirmed. "We built those numbers with significant cushion." Clara leaned forward slightly. "We ran 3 separate projections." She said, her voice smooth and authoritative. "Nathan's team is nothing if not thorough." Nathan's team, as if she were a senior partner, as if she had built the models herself, which she had not. The models had been built by Grant Capital's analyst department, led by a man named David Cho, who had been with the company for 9 years, and who Clara referred to privately as Nathan's number guy, as if David were a piece of office equipment. Patricia Gould's eyes moved to Clara with a careful measuring assessment. "And you are—" "Clara Voss," Clara said, "Nathan's chief of staff." It was the first time Evelyn had heard her use that title, chief of staff. She filed it away. Nathan smiled as if this were entirely natural, as if Clara had been promoted and he'd simply forgotten to tell anyone. Evelyn said nothing. She lifted her fork and took a small, deliberate bite of her scallop and watched. The dinner progressed. Nathan talked. Clara talked almost as much, redirecting questions when she felt Nathan was losing momentum, adding details he hadn't provided occasionally, finishing his sentences with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this particular performance many times. The investors listened with the calibrated politeness of people who had not yet decided what they thought. Marcus Webb said little. Patricia Gould asked careful questions. The 2 younger associates from Denner Capital took notes. And Evelyn sat at the far end of the table and performed her own particular role, gracious, quiet, unobtrusive. She asked one of the associates about his background. She listened attentively when Patricia mentioned her fund's recent pivot toward sustainable infrastructure. She refilled her own water glass because Clara had positioned herself between Nathan and the nearest server in a way that meant Evelyn was consistently outside the service radius. Small thing, but not accidental. It was during the second course, a roasted duck breast that Evelyn had also quietly selected from the kitchen's private menu, that the first significant moment arrived. Patricia Gould turned to Evelyn directly and asked, "Mrs. Grant, have you been involved in the Caldwell evaluation process?" "At all? I find that company leadership's family perspective can sometimes surface things the analysts miss." It was a genuinely respectful question, the kind of question that assumed Evelyn had a perspective worth hearing. Before Evelyn could respond, Clara said, "Evelyn has been wonderful at supporting Nathan through the process. These dinners can be quite a lot to coordinate." She said it with a warm smile, as if she were doing Evelyn a favor, as if she were protecting her from the pressure of having to answer a complex business question. The implication was crystalline. Evelyn's contribution was coordination. Logistics, wifely support. Patricia Gould's eyes moved from Clara back to Evelyn, with a flicker of something curiosity, perhaps, or the particular attentiveness of a woman who recognized condescension when it was served with a smile. Evelyn held Patricia's gaze for exactly 1 beat. Then she said mildly, "I've been paying close attention to the Caldwell situation for some time." She smiled. "These things have a way of revealing themselves when you're patient." It was a perfectly ordinary sentence. It meant nothing on its surface. But Patricia Gould heard something in it because Patricia Gould was the kind of woman who listened beneath the words, and she held Evelyn's gaze for a half-second longer than was conversationally necessary before nodding slowly and turning back to Nathan. Clara's smile had not wavered, but her hand, Evelyn noticed, had gripped her wine glass slightly tighter. Nathan, oblivious, launched into another set of projections. This was the pattern of Evelyn Grant's life for the past 3 years. Not her entire marriage, the first 4 years had been different, had been a genuine partnership built on shared ambition and mutual respect, and the kind of intimacy that only comes when two people are genuinely working toward the same thing. Nathan had been different then, or perhaps she had simply known him differently. Either way, something had shifted approximately 3 years ago, around the time Clara Voss had arrived, and the shift had been so gradual, so incremental, that Evelyn sometimes wondered if Nathan had even noticed it happening. She had noticed. She had documented it. Not out of paranoia. Evelyn was not a paranoid woman, but out of the same methodical precision that had made her family's investment authority one of the most respected in the Northeast for 60 years. When patterns emerge, you record them. When behavior changes, you note the timeline. When someone begins systematically eroding your position, you don't panic. You gather information. You understand the full scope of what is happening. And then, when the moment is right, you act. The moment she had decided 3 weeks ago was very nearly right. She had said nothing to Nathan, not because she was afraid of the conversation, but because she understood that premature disclosure would simply give Clara time to prepare a defense and give Nathan time to construct a version of reality that protected them both. Evelyn was not interested in giving anyone time to prepare. She was interested in truth emerging in conditions that made revision impossible. A dinner with investors. Perfect conditions. She watched Nathan reach over and refill Clara's wine glass. Not Patricia's, not Marcus's, not any of the other guests at the table. Clara's. It was a small gesture, automatic, thoughtless, which was precisely what made it significant. The gestures people make without thinking are the ones that reveal the truth most clearly. Marcus Webb saw it too. His eyes moved to Evelyn for just a fraction of a second. She gave him nothing in return. Not because she was unmoved, but because she had made a decision a long time ago that she would not perform distress for an audience. "Nathan," Clara said, her voice dropping to a register that was technically still audible to the table, but that carried the texture of something private. "You should tell them about the governance restructure. That's the piece that'll really land." Nathan pivoted immediately like a man who had been waiting for the cue. "Right, yes, so the restructure. What we've done is essentially..." Evelyn set down her fork very quietly. She folded her hands in her lap. She breathed. There were things she knew that no one else at this table knew, things she had known for some time and had been deciding carefully how and when to use. She knew, for instance, that the Caldwell acquisition, the centerpiece of tonight's entire presentation, had a structural problem that Nathan's team had either missed or deliberately obscured in their documentation. She knew because she had read the Caldwell financials herself through a channel that Nathan didn't know she had, and she had identified a liability in Caldwell's third-quarter projections that made the acquisition's 38% growth estimate not conservative, but wildly optimistic. She also knew that Hartwell Trust, the institution her family had chaired for 2 generations, was one of the 3 major stakeholders whose approval was required for the Caldwell deal to close. Without Hartwell's sign-off, the acquisition died. Without the acquisition, Grant Capital's expansion strategy collapsed. Without the expansion strategy, the confidence of every investor currently sitting at this table evaporated. Nathan did not know any of this about her position at Hartwell. He had known when they married that her family was connected to the trust. But he had never asked the specific nature of that connection, and Evelyn had never elaborated. And somewhere in the comfortable architecture of Nathan's ego, he had filed his wife under family money useful for early capital and moved on to more immediately interesting topics. She had come to understand perhaps the most consequential oversight of his professional life. She reached for her water glass, took a slow sip, replaced it precisely in the center of its ring on the white linen tablecloth. Then Clara said something that changed the temperature of the room. It was directed at Patricia Gould, who had been asking about the due diligence process for the Caldwell deal. Clara said smoothly, and without any apparent awareness of what she was doing, "We've been extremely thorough. Nathan trusts very few people with the sensitive material, which is why we keep the circle tight. Honestly, the fewer opinions in the room, the cleaner the process." She didn't look at Evelyn when she said it. She didn't need to. The fewer opinions in the room. Patricia Gould's expression didn't change, but her pen, which had been resting against her notepad, was suddenly being held with the tightness of someone actively restraining a reaction. Marcus Webb looked at his plate. Evelyn looked at Clara. And for the first time all evening, something moved behind Evelyn's eyes. Not anger exactly, but the particular clarity that comes when a decision that has been forming for a very long time finally locks into place with an audible internal click. She was done waiting. Not tonight. The timing for the full revelation was not tonight. Not yet the sequence she had mapped required one more piece. But the waiting, the patient, methodical, deliberate waiting that she had maintained for 3 years, that specific variety of endurance was over. Whatever happened next at this table, Evelyn Grant was no longer in the room as a background figure. She was in the room as the person who was going to determine what happened next. She placed both hands flat on the tablecloth, breathed once, looked at Nathan, who was nodding enthusiastically at something Clara had just said, his confidence entirely intact, his awareness of his wife's presence at the table essentially zero. Then she picked up her fork again, cut a precise piece of duck breast, and ate it calmly. And beneath that absolute calm, she was already calculating move by move, conversation by conversation, exactly how the next 48 hours were going to unfold. Because Clara Voss had said the wrong thing to the wrong people in front of exactly the wrong woman. And Evelyn Grant, chairperson of Hartwell Trust, primary stakeholder in the Caldwell acquisition, and the woman who had quietly held this company together for 7 years while her husband performed its success for investors, Evelyn Grant had very good memory. She remembered everything, and she had been patient long enough. The dessert course arrived, chocolate fondant with a raspberry coulis, warm and precisely timed, placed in front of each guest by a server who moved with quiet professionalism. The table had softened slightly, the wine had done its work, and the conversation had drifted toward lighter territory. Market anecdotes, summer travel, the kind of social mortar that fills the spaces between business and goodbye. Clara Evelyn noticed had shifted her chair approximately 3 inches closer to Nathan's during the dessert course. Not dramatic, not obvious to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But Evelyn was always paying close attention. Marcus Webb was describing a trip he'd taken to Portugal when Clara interrupted him, not rudely, but with the practiced smoothness of someone who had learned to make interruption feel like contribution to redirect the conversation back to Nathan's upcoming speaking engagement at a financial leadership summit. Marcus stopped mid-sentence. He looked at Clara, then he looked at Evelyn. And in that look was the entire unspoken history of what was happening at this table. A man of 64 who had watched enough corporate dynamics to recognize a particular species of slow-motion disaster. His eyes said, "I see this." "Do you?" Evelyn's eyes said very quietly, "I've been seeing it for 3 years." She lifted her spoon and tasted the fondant. It was perfect. She had chosen well. Nathan was laughing at something Clara had said, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his own story. Around the table, the investors smiled and nodded. Patricia Gould asked a follow-up question about the summit. The younger associates exchanged a glance that was too brief to interpret. And the dinner continued warm and luminous and entirely deceptive, while at the far end of the table, Evelyn Grant finished her dessert with the quiet precision of a woman who had already decided that the next time someone at this table tried to make her invisible, there would be consequences that none of them were prepared for. She set down her spoon, folded her napkin, and waited for the moment that she knew with the certainty of someone who had spent 3 years watching the exact same pattern build toward the exact same breaking point was coming. She didn't know it would be tonight. She didn't know it would be Clara's hand against her face, but she knew something was coming, and she was ready. The coffee came at 8:47. Evelyn knew the time because she had been tracking the evening with the quiet precision of someone who understood that timing in situations like this one was everything. The dessert plates had been cleared. The servers had moved efficiently and without disruption. And the room had settled into that particular post-dinner register where guards come down and real conversations begin to surface through the pleasant noise of social obligation. Nathan had pushed his chair back slightly from the table the way he always did when he felt the evening was going well, and he wanted to physically signal relaxation. Clara had matched the movement unconsciously or deliberately. Evelyn had long stopped trying to determine which category Clara's actions fell into, because with Clara, everything deliberate eventually became unconscious habit, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing about her. Marcus Webb was stirring his coffee. Patricia Gould had set aside her notepad. The two younger associates from Denner Capital had the slightly glazed look of people who had consumed exactly one glass of wine, more than was professionally advisable, and were now working hard to appear sharp. The conversation had drifted, as these things do, from formal presentation to something looser. Nathan was talking about leadership philosophy, a topic he returned to frequently in social settings because it allowed him to perform depth without requiring specific accountability. He was good at it. He had the vocabulary and the cadence and the particular kind of eye contact that made people feel personally seen while revealing nothing genuinely personal. Clara watched him with an expression that Evelyn recognized. It was not admiration exactly. It was investment, the way a person watches something they believe they own. And then Patricia Gould did something unexpected. She turned to Evelyn again, not with the polite conversational gesture of someone including a quiet guest, with something more direct. She said, "Mrs. Grant, I want to come back to something you said earlier. You mentioned you'd been paying close attention to the Caldwell situation. I'm curious what that attention has surfaced for you." The table shifted. It was subtle, a slight reorientation of posture, a rerouting of attention, but Evelyn felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Clara's chin came up by a fraction. Nathan's eyes moved to Evelyn with an expression that contained, she noticed, the faintest trace of something she could only describe as territorial unease, as if the question itself were a boundary violation he hadn't anticipated. Evelyn took a single breath, looked at Patricia with the measured steadiness she'd been cultivating for decades, and said, "I think any complex acquisition reveals its real shape over time. The numbers that look strong in the first quarter of due diligence aren't always the numbers that matter in the third. Patience tends to surface what urgency misses." It was not a full disclosure. It was not meant to be. But it was specific enough and delivered with enough quiet authority that Patricia Gould tilted her head slightly, the movement of someone recalibrating an assumption. Marcus Webb set down his coffee spoon. Nathan said with a laugh that was about 3 beats too quick, "Evelyn has always had strong instincts. She's been a tremendous support through the whole process." He said it warmly, lovingly even, in a tone that was designed to absorb her comment into the category of wifely encouragement rather than professional assessment. He was good at that too, the reframe, the gentle reclassification, the loving burial. But Patricia Gould was not looking at Nathan. She was still looking at Evelyn, and what she said next was quiet enough that only the people immediately around them caught it clearly. Support or something more substantive? The question hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough, because in those 3 seconds, Clara Voss made a decision that would, in retrospect, define the entire architecture of what came next. She leaned forward, placed one hand lightly on the table between herself and Patricia, and said with a smile so smooth it almost disguised the precision of the weapon, "Evelyn is wonderfully devoted. Nathan is very lucky to have that kind of support at home, especially during high-pressure cycles like this one. It means so much that she takes an interest. As if Evelyn were a curious bystander, a supportive spouse who had picked up some terminology from overhearing boardroom calls. As if the woman sitting at the far end of this table were a charming accessory to the real story, not a primary character in it. Patricia Gould's expression went very still. Marcus Webb looked at his coffee cup, his coffee, and Evelyn felt something move through her chest, not heat, not the sharp flare of anger, but something colder and more precise. The sensation of a door closing, of a decision finalizing, of the last remaining thread of restraint being cut cleanly without drama, without ceremony. She said nothing. She picked up her coffee cup, drank from it, set it down, and across the table, Clara smiled at Nathan as if nothing had happened, because as far as Clara was concerned, nothing had. She had done what she always did: neutralized, redirected, repackaged, managed the optics, kept the narrative clean. What Clara had never understood in 4 years of managing everything she could reach was that the narratives she couldn't see were the ones that would undo her. Nathan was nodding at something Marcus had said. The conversation had moved on as conversations do, and the surface of the evening had smoothed itself back into politeness. But beneath the surface, something had cracked. Evelyn could feel it the way you feel a crack in ice before you hear it through your feet, through your bones, before the sound ever reaches your ears. She excused herself from the table quietly. "Just a moment," she murmured to no one in particular, and stood and walked toward the corridor outside the dining room with the unhurried movement of someone going to check their phone. She did check her phone. There was a message from her attorney, David Rice, sent 40 minutes ago. "Documents are filed as of this morning. Hartwell Board confirmed. All in order. Waiting on your word." She read it twice. Typed back, "Hold. Not yet." She stood in the corridor for exactly 90 seconds, long enough to breathe, long enough to remind herself of the sequence she had built, the timing she had chosen, the reasons she had chosen it. Long enough to remember that the version of this story where she acted from anger was not the version that ended with the outcome she wanted. The outcome she wanted was not revenge. She needed to be clear about that, even now, even in the corridor with Patricia Gould's voice still ringing in her head and Clara's smile still burning somewhere at the back of her mind. Revenge was noise. What she wanted was accountability, structure, the restoration of something that had been systematically dismantled, not just her position in Nathan's life, but the integrity of the institution that her family had built and that Nathan had been slowly, unconsciously using as a personal resource without acknowledging what it was. She put her phone in her jacket pocket, went back to the table. She had been gone 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, the configuration at the table had shifted. Nathan had moved his chair closer to Clara's, not dramatically, not obviously, but measurably. The two associates had their heads bent together over something on a phone screen. Marcus Webb had turned slightly toward Patricia Gould, and they were in what appeared to be a quiet private conversation that stopped when Evelyn reappeared. Not from guilt, but from the particular discretion of two people who had been discussing something they didn't want interrupted. Evelyn sat down, reached for her coffee, found it had gone cold. A server appeared almost immediately, one of the younger ones, attentive, apologetic, and replaced it with a fresh cup without being asked. She thanked him quietly. Nathan didn't notice the exchange. Clara noticed it, and her eyes tracked the server briefly in the way of someone cataloging information she wasn't sure was relevant. Marcus Webb cleared his throat softly and said to the table in general, but directed Evelyn understood somewhere in her direction, "I've always believed that the most important capital in any enterprise isn't financial. It's relational. The networks that hold a business together during stress are built over years. They don't show up on any balance sheet." He paused, sipped his coffee. "But they determine survival." It was a statement that could mean anything. In the context of a financial leadership dinner, it was about investor relationships, institutional trust, long-term partnership. Nathan took it that way immediately, nodding with the enthusiasm of a man who had just heard his own philosophy reflected back at him in slightly more eloquent language. But Marcus had been looking at Evelyn when he said it, and Evelyn understood. He was not talking about investor relationships. He was telling her in the careful language of a man who knew how rooms worked that he saw what she had built, that he understood what she was holding, that whatever was about to happen, and a man like Marcus Webb, who had watched enough corporate dinners to read the temperature of a room the way a sailor reads weather, whatever was about to happen, he was not going to be surprised by it. Evelyn held his gaze for exactly 1 second, gave him nothing visible in return. But she thought, good. Good that you see it. Because you're going to need to remember this moment clearly when the morning comes and everything changes. Nathan said, "Marcus, you're exactly right. That's actually something I want to address in the Q3 communication. The idea that Grant Capital's strength is relational as much as structural. Clara, can you make a note of that?" He turned to his assistant as naturally as he might turn to an extension of himself. Clara already had her phone in her hand, already typing. Patricia Gould watched this, said nothing. But her jaw had tightened in a way that was very small and very specific, the tightening of a woman who had spent a career in rooms where this kind of dynamic played out and had developed strong opinions about it. The evening was moving toward its natural conclusion. Jackets were being straightened, dessert wine was being declined. The ambient energy of the room had begun its gentle turn toward farewell. Evelyn could feel the window narrowing. Not for the full revelation that had its own timeline, its own sequence, its own moment, that was not tonight, but for the next step, for the thing that needed to happen before people started standing up and shaking hands and pretending this dinner had been uncomplicated. She had a document on her phone, had carried it for 11 days, had reviewed it 17 times. It was a preliminary governance assessment, 4 pages dry technical. The kind of language that meant nothing to civilians, but meant everything to anyone who understood how institutional investment structures worked. It outlined in precise and unarguable terms a set of compliance concerns related to the Caldwell acquisition that would need to be addressed before Hartwell Trust could proceed with its stakeholder approval. She had not planned to share it tonight. She had planned to route it through formal channels through David Rice, through the Trust's communications office. The proper sequence, the clean sequence. But Clara had said that she takes an interest, and something in Evelyn had recalculated. She was reaching for her phone when Clara spoke again. Not to her, not directly. Clara was addressing Marcus Webb, and she was asking about his timeline for the Denner Capital decision, and the question was entirely reasonable and professionally appropriate. But the way she asked it, the way she positioned her body as she asked it, the way she had been positioning her body all evening, was a performance of a role that was not hers. She spoke as if she were a partner at this table, as if her opinion on Marcus Webb's timeline had institutional weight, as if she were not an executive assistant who had inflated her own title to chief of staff 40 minutes ago without apparent authorization. And Marcus Webb answered her with the patient courtesy of a man who was too experienced to correct someone publicly, but who was internally filing this entire interaction under a very specific category. Nathan, meanwhile, had picked up his own phone and was reading something. He angled the screen away from Clara's line of sight slightly, then seemed to remember where he was and put it down. The gesture lasted perhaps 2 seconds. But Evelyn, who had spent years studying Nathan's microbehaviors, because Nathan's microbehaviors were the truest edition of him, noticed. He was managing something he didn't want Clara to see, which meant there were still spaces between them, still information he kept from her, which meant the degree of his investment in her was bounded by some remaining instinct for self-preservation that hadn't yet been fully overridden. It changed nothing, but she noted it. Patricia Gould was speaking now, asking Nathan a question about the Grant Capital Board composition, a neutral question, professionally appropriate, and Nathan was answering it with his usual fluency, and Clara had leaned back slightly in her chair with the particular quality of someone who is resting between performances. And then the moment arrived that Evelyn had not planned for, could not have planned for. One of the younger associates, a man in his early 30s named, according to the placement card, James Ellery, had apparently consumed enough wine to have misplaced his professional filter entirely. He leaned toward the associate beside him, the woman whose card read Sarah Chen, and said something in a low voice. What he said was not entirely audible. What was audible in the particular acoustic configuration of this room to the people at Evelyn's end of the table was the word wife, and then a half-swallowed laugh that was the specific laugh of someone making a joke at someone else's expense. Sarah Chen's face went carefully blank, the kind of blank that means the joke was not funny and the audience was not willing to signal that. Evelyn had heard it. She held very still. Clara had heard it, and she did something that Evelyn had not expected, something that told her more about the true structure of this evening than anything else that had happened. Clara heard it, and she smiled. Just slightly, just at the corner of her mouth. A smile she didn't redirect, didn't suppress, didn't recalibrate into something more appropriate. She let it sit, which meant she agreed with it, or had authored it, or both. And Nathan, who had been mid-sentence when James Ellery laughed, paused for approximately half a beat. Had he heard it? Had he caught enough of it and then continued his sentence without breaking stride? He had heard it. He had chosen not to address it. Evelyn placed both hands flat on the tablecloth. This was a physical habit she had developed in the past 3 years as a substitute for the reactions she chose not to perform. The pressure of her palms against the linen was grounding. Specific, real. She was not going to cry. She had not cried over Nathan's choices in a very long time because she had understood for some time that the correct response to this particular species of loss was not grief, but clarity. And she was extraordinarily clear right now. She was clear about what James Ellery had said. She was clear about Clara's smile. She was clear about Nathan's silence. She was clear about the document on her phone. She was clear about David Rice's message. She was clear about Marcus Webb and Patricia Gould and the Hartwell board confirmation that had landed quietly this morning while Nathan was in a breakfast meeting that Clara had scheduled. She picked up her phone, opened the document, looked at the 4 pages she had reviewed 17 times, made a decision, slid the phone across the table to Marcus Webb. No explanation, no preamble, no announcement of what it was. She simply placed it in front of him with the screen open and went back to her coffee. Marcus looked at it, picked it up, read the first paragraph, read the second. His expression did not change, which was the expression of a man who had just been handed something significant and was choosing his response very carefully. He read to the bottom of the first page, looked up. Nathan was still talking. Clara had turned back to Nathan. Nobody else at the table had seen the exchange. Marcus Webb looked at Evelyn across the table with the specific look of someone who has just revised an assessment significantly upward. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, which in the economy of a moment like this was a substantial length of time, and then nodded once, just once, very slightly, and continued reading. Evelyn finished her coffee, set the cup down without a sound. The thing that had been a plan was now in motion. The sequence she had built over 3 years, document by document, conversation by conversation, connection by connection, it was moving now. Not explosively, not dramatically, with the quiet, irreversible momentum of something structural, the kind of movement you don't notice until it has already changed the landscape entirely. Nathan was laughing at something. Clara's hand had moved to the back of his chair, resting on it lightly, easily, in the casual, proprietary way of someone who had come to think of that space as hers. Evelyn looked at Clara's hand on her husband's chair, looked at Marcus Webb reading the document, looked at Patricia Gould, who was watching Nathan with an expression that had shifted in the last 10 minutes from politely interested to something more clinical. She thought, not tonight, not the full thing, not tonight. But the pieces are in place now. Every piece. The evening would end. People would stand, shake hands, say the right things, collect their coats. Cars would be called. Business cards would be exchanged. It would look from the outside like a successful dinner. Nathan would walk out of this room believing he had performed well, that his empire was intact, that his assistant had been an asset, that his wife had been appropriately decorative. He would be wrong about all of it. But he wouldn't know that yet. And Evelyn, who had learned the hard way that the most powerful position is not the loudest one in the room, but the one with the most complete information, was content to let him walk out of here still believing in the version of the story he had constructed. For now. Because tomorrow morning Marcus Webb would make a phone call, and Patricia Gould would make a phone call, and the Hartwell board, which had already confirmed what Evelyn had asked them to confirm, would begin a process that could not be undone, could not be redirected, could not be managed by the most efficient executive assistant in the world. She reached for her jacket, folded it over her arm. Around her, the table was beginning its natural dissolution into farewell. Napkins placed down, chairs pushed back, the pleasant administrative rituals of endings. Nathan stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked across the table at Evelyn with the particular look he had developed over the past 2 years, warm, slightly distant, the look of a man who was grateful for her presence in a room without being entirely sure why she was in it. "Ready," he said, as if she'd been waiting on him. Evelyn looked at her husband, really looked at him the way she hadn't let herself look in a very long time, because looking clearly at something you once loved requires a specific kind of courage that depletes itself if overused. She saw Nathan Grant, 51 years old, smart, charming, dangerously comfortable with his own version of events, a man who had been handed a gift of extraordinary proportions and had mistaken it for his own talent. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." She stood, smoothed her blazer, said goodbye to Patricia Gould with a handshake that lasted exactly the right length of time, said something brief and warm to the associates, stopped at Marcus Webb's side long enough for him to press her phone back into her hand and say very quietly just below the noise of the room, "Thorough work, Mrs. Grant, very thorough." She said, "Thank you, Marcus," and walked toward the door. Behind her, she could hear Clara organizing Nathan's departure, telling him something about tomorrow's schedule, asking about the car service, filling every available inch of his attention the way she always did. The way that had become so normal that Nathan no longer noticed it was happening. Evelyn stepped into the corridor, breathed, sent one word to David Rice, "Ready," and then she went to get her coat. The car ride home took 22 minutes. Evelyn counted them. Not because she was anxious, but because silence in an enclosed space with Nathan had a particular quality these days, dense textured, filled with the things neither of them was saying, and counting was a way of staying anchored inside her own clarity, rather than getting pulled into the undertow of what the silence used to mean when they were different people in a different version of this marriage. Nathan was on his phone for the first 14 minutes, typing, scrolling, occasionally exhaling through his nose in the way he did when something mildly irritated him. He didn't share what it was. He didn't look up. The driver navigated through Midtown with the smooth efficiency of someone paid to be invisible, and the city moved past the windows in blurs of light. And Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought about David Rice's confirmation and Marcus Webb's face when he read the first page of the document and the single word she had sent into the dark 30 minutes ago. "Ready." At the 14-minute mark, Nathan put his phone down, looked at her, said, "You were quiet tonight." It was not an observation. It was a mild accusation wrapped in the language of concern. She had learned to hear the difference. "I was present," she said. "There's a distinction." He made a small sound. Not agreement, not disagreement. The sound of a man who had decided not to pursue a line of conversation that might require him to be accountable for something. Patricia seemed engaged. Webb was hard to read as always. He paused. Clara handled the Caldwell presentation well. Evelyn turned her head and looked at him directly. "Clara presented your company's acquisition strategy to your investors at a formal dinner. She was supporting the presentation. She introduced herself as your chief of staff." Something moved across Nathan's face. Not guilt. She wasn't sure Nathan experienced guilt in the straightforward way most people did. It was more like recalibration, the micro-adjustment of a man rerouting around a question he didn't want to answer directly. It's an informal title. It reflects her expanded responsibilities. "When did you give her that title?" "Evelyn." "I'm asking a simple question, Nathan. When did Clara Voss become your chief of staff, and why wasn't it communicated to the board?" The driver's posture was very carefully neutral, professional invisibility maintained with precision. Nathan said, "This isn't the time." "You're right," Evelyn said. "It isn't." And she turned back to the window and did not say another word for the remaining 8 minutes of the drive. Inside, she was not angry. She was deeply, specifically awake. Every nerve lit with the particular voltage of a person moving through the last hours before a significant, irreversible thing. She had spent 3 years building toward this. She was not going to compromise the architecture of it in the back of a car, because Nathan had casually dropped Clara's name as the evening's success story. They arrived home at 10:43. The apartment was quiet. They had no children, a choice they had made together in the early years, and which Evelyn was now in the most private part of herself profoundly grateful for. She went directly to the study, the room Nathan had never shown much interest in because it contained her work rather than his, and she sat at her desk and opened her laptop. There were 7 new emails. 3 were from the Hartwell board, 2 were from David Rice, 1 was from Marcus Webb sent at 10:31, which was 9 minutes after they'd left the Sterling Club, which meant Marcus had gone directly to his car and typed it before he'd even gotten home. The subject line read, "Re-Governance Review Preliminary Assessment." The body read, "Reviewed the document. I'd like to speak tomorrow morning early. I'll reach out to Patricia as well. I think we have the same questions." M.W. Evelyn read it twice. Then she forwarded it to David Rice with a single line, "Begin formal notification process tomorrow 8 a.m. She closed the laptop, sat in the quiet of her study for 3 full minutes. let herself feel briefly the weight of what was already in motion. Not with regret, she had examined this decision from every angle available to her, and she did not regret it. But with the specific solemnity of someone who understands that some doors once opened do not close again. Then she went to bed. Nathan came in at midnight. She heard him, did not stir, lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of him moving around the room with the careless confidence of a man who believed his world was entirely intact. And she thought by this time, tomorrow he will know that it isn't. And she felt something she hadn't expected, not satisfaction exactly, but a clean, clear sadness, the sadness of a woman who had loved a man genuinely, had built something real with him, and had watched him dismantle it so incrementally that he'd never noticed what he was destroying. She slept. Nathan did not know that she slept easily. He would have assumed she lay awake, troubled, tangled in the emotional aftermath of whatever tension he believed she was carrying. He would have been wrong. Evelyn Grant slept well because she had no unresolved decisions keeping her awake. Every decision was made. Everything was in motion. The only thing left was to let it arrive. It arrived the following morning in the form of a phone call that Nathan took in the kitchen at 7:52 while Evelyn was in the study. She could hear his voice through the wall, not the words at first, just the register. Confident, then questioning, then the particular shift that happened when Nathan encountered information he hadn't expected and couldn't immediately control. Lower, tighter, the voice of a man recalculating. She made no move to go to him. She opened her email, read the formal notification that David Rice had sent at 8 o'clock on the mark, read the response from Hartwell's communications director already in her inbox at 8:14, read the preliminary holding statement that the trust's legal team had drafted overnight. Everything was clean. Everything was documented. Everything was moving through the appropriate channels with the unhurried authority of an institution that had been operating with integrity for 60 years and was very clear on its own procedures. At 8:21, Nathan appeared in the doorway of the study. He was still holding his phone. His jaw was set in the specific way it set when he was working hard to appear composed. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she looked back at him with the patient steadiness of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. "Who called Marcus Webb last night?" he said. "I gave Marcus a document," she said. "He called you." "He called my board chair at 7:30 this morning, my board chair." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not anger, not hurt, but something underneath both of those, something closer to genuine shock. "Evelyn, what did you give him?" "A preliminary governance assessment related to the Caldwell acquisition." Nathan stared at her. How did you even, that's confidential analysis. That's internal. "The assessment was prepared by Hartwell Trust's review committee," she said, "which I chair." The silence that followed that sentence was the longest silence she had heard in years. Nathan stood in the doorway of her study, and she watched him try in real time to restructure his understanding of what he was standing inside. It was like watching someone realize mid-sentence that the language they'd been speaking for years was not the only language in the room. That there was an entire conversation happening simultaneously in a language they'd never learned because they'd never believed they needed to. "You chair the Hartwell Trust Review Committee," he said slowly. "I chair the board," she said. "I have for 3 years." Another silence, longer. "You never told me." She looked at him steadily. "You never asked." That landed the way she knew it would. Not cleanly, not with the surgical precision she might have wanted. Landing truth on someone who isn't ready for it is never clean, but fully. She watched it move through him, watched him trace the implications backward through 3 years of dinners and conversations and decisions he'd made based on a version of his wife that was significantly incomplete. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something in his face shifted again, harder, faster, the shift of a man receiving bad news in rapid sequence. "That's Christine," he said. "Christine Hale, his board chair. I have to take this." "Yes," Evelyn said. "You do." He left the doorway. She heard him in the corridor, his voice dropping to the low, urgent register of a man running damage assessment. She opened the Hartwell Board's group thread, read the morning's updates, sent 2 replies, forwarded 1 attachment to David Rice. At 9:15, Clara Voss arrived at the apartment. This was not unusual. Clara had a key another boundary erosion that had happened so gradually that Evelyn had documented it, but not challenged it, because the documentation was more useful than the confrontation would have been. Clara arrived most weekday mornings to coordinate Nathan's schedule handle, his correspondence brief him on the day's priorities. She had been doing this for 2 years. The apartment had become, in some functional sense, an extension of the office, which meant that the boundary between Nathan's professional and personal life had not so much blurred as dissolved, and Clara existed comfortably on both sides of where that boundary used to be. Evelyn heard the door, heard Clara's voice in the entryway. Her characteristic briskness, the sound of a tote bag being set down, the slight click of heels on the hardwood. Heard Nathan's voice answering from the corridor, lower, more urgent than his normal morning register. A brief exchange that Evelyn couldn't fully hear. Then she heard Clara say clearly enough to carry through the study door, she gave Marcus Webb what, and Nathan's voice lower, "Not now. Nathan, if the Hartwell assessment is already with the board chair, we need to get ahead of—" "I said not now, Clara." A brief silence, then Clara's heels moving toward the kitchen. Evelyn sat at her desk and breathed steadily and thought about the particular grammar of what she'd just heard. "We need to get ahead of it. Not you. We." As if Clara's interests and Nathan's interests were a single, unified thing. As if the crisis management of this situation were Clara's professional responsibility and her personal one simultaneously, without distinction between the two. 3 years of documentation. And still hearing it plainly, it had a specific quality of wrongness that no amount of preparation entirely cushioned. She stood, walked out of the study, into the kitchen. Nathan was at the counter with his phone. Clara was beside him, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, looking at his screen. They both looked up when Evelyn entered. There was a beat, the specific beat of two people who have been caught in a proximity that neither can explain cleanly. Clara recovered first. She always recovered first. "Good morning, Evelyn," she said with the particular warmth of someone performing warmth rather than feeling it. "Nathan was just briefing me on—" "I know what he was briefing you on," Evelyn said. Not unkindly, simply as fact. Clara tilted her head. It was a gesture Evelyn had catalogued, the slight tilt that preceded a reframe, a redirect, a careful repositioning of the conversation toward territory Clara controlled. "I think there may be some miscommunication around the Hartwell document. Nathan and I were just discussing the best way to—" "Clara," Evelyn said, "this is a conversation for Nathan and me." A pause. Clara looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the counter. And Clara said, and this was the moment, this was the sentence that Evelyn would later identify as the one that broke the last remaining dam between patience and consequence. Clara said, with a smile that was nearly sympathetic. "Of course, though Nathan usually finds it helpful to have me present for complex discussions. Don't you, Nathan?" It wasn't a question. Nathan said nothing. He said nothing. Evelyn looked at her husband. Looked at the man she had married, who was standing in his own kitchen in his own home, and was saying nothing, while his assistant told his wife that her husband required a third party present for conversations with his own wife. Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, not with noise, but Evelyn felt it, and she believed Nathan felt it, and she was certain Clara felt it, because Clara's smile flickered just briefly, just for a fraction of a second before she steadied it. "Nathan," Evelyn said very quietly, "I'd like you to ask Clara to leave." Nathan finally looked up. His expression was complicated discomfort guilt, the particular paralysis of a man caught between two forces he'd been pretending weren't in conflict. "Evelyn, let's not make this— I'm not making it anything," she said. "I'm asking you to ask your assistant to give us a private conversation in our home. That's a reasonable request." Another silence, longer than it should have been, significantly longer. And then Clara said, and her voice had lost the warmth, now something sharper coming through something that had always been there beneath the professional surface, but that rarely showed itself this directly. Clara said, "She's upset about the dinner. This is personal, Nathan. You shouldn't let personal dynamics interfere with what we need to handle today. She's upset. As if Evelyn were a problem to be managed, as if her presence in her own kitchen were an obstacle to productivity." Nathan's jaw tightened. He said, "Clara, the board call is in 40 minutes," Clara said smoothly, pivoting the absolute confidence of someone who has learned that pivoting forward is more effective than defending ground. "We need to go over the talking points. This can wait. This can wait." Evelyn looked at Clara Voss, really looked at her. Not with anger. Anger was a luxury she had decided long ago she couldn't afford in this particular war, but with the complete, unobstructed clarity of a woman who had just heard something that removed every last uncertainty she'd been carrying. It was not about the title, not about the dinners, not about the access or the key or the morning briefings or the 3 years of slow incremental erasure. It was about this, a 31-year-old assistant standing in Evelyn Grant's kitchen, telling Evelyn Grant that Evelyn Grant's concerns could wait. Evelyn said calmly, "The board call has been postponed." Clara blinked. "What?" "Christine Hale postponed it an hour ago. Hartwell's legal team requested additional time to review documentation before Nathan speaks to the board. I expect you haven't seen the notification yet." She paused. "It was sent to Nathan's board correspondence, not to yours." A silence that was different from the silences before it. Harder, more specific. Clara looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at his phone, opened something, read it. His face did the thing again, the recalibration, the rapid restructuring, the expression of a man realizing that the ground he was standing on was not the ground he'd mapped. Clara's composure held, but just barely. Just at the edges of it, something was fraying, and Evelyn could see it because she had been watching Clara's composure for 4 years, and she knew every texture of it. She knew what real composure looked like, and she knew what performed composure looked like, and right now Clara's was performed. "I should look into that," Clara said. "You should," Evelyn agreed. Clara picked up her phone, stepped back from the counter, looked at Nathan once more with an expression that was trying to be reassuring and landing somewhere closer to desperate. Then she walked toward the living room, heels clicking, phone already at her ear. Nathan and Evelyn were alone in the kitchen for the first time in what felt like months. He looked at her. And for the first time since the car ride home the previous night, there was something in his eyes that wasn't recalibration or damage control. Something raw. Something she recognized from years ago, from a different version of the two of them, something that looked almost like genuine recognition. Like he was looking at his wife and seeing for the first time in a long time that she was not who he had decided she was. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice had a different quality. The performance was gone, just his voice. "What is happening?" She looked at him for a long moment, thought about the 22-minute car ride, the 14 minutes of his phone, the 8 minutes of silence. Thought about 7 years of dinners and dismissals, and one Tuesday in March 3 years ago, when she had made a decision in the parking garage of a midtown building that she was not going to keep contracting herself to fit the smaller and smaller space Nathan's choices were making for her. She said, "The truth is happening, Nathan. That's all." In the living room, Clara's voice was urgent and low, working her phone the way she always worked every problem with speed, with efficiency, with the absolute conviction that she could manage the shape of any situation if she moved fast enough. But this was not a situation that could be managed. This was a structure that had been quietly, methodically, irreversibly changed. And in the kitchen, Nathan Grant stood with his phone in his hand and looked at his wife as if he were only now beginning to understand that she had been the most important person in the room at every dinner, every meeting, every decision point for the entirety of their marriage, and that he had spent 7 years making sure she knew how little he had noticed. The morning was only getting started. And what came next? What came in the hours that followed when the calls multiplied and the emails arrived and the board members started comparing notes, and Clara began to understand the true dimensions of what she was standing inside. What came next would make this kitchen conversation look like the calm before the kind of storm that doesn't leave the landscape the same. Evelyn reached for the coffee pot, poured herself a cup, stood at her own counter in her own kitchen, and drank it quietly while her husband stood 6 feet away and tried to find the words for a question he didn't yet know how to ask. She waited. She was very good at waiting. Nathan found his voice at 9:47. Not the voice he used at investor dinners, not the calibrated warmth, not the performed authority. This was the voice underneath all of that. Rawer, less rehearsed. The voice of a man who had just spent 20 minutes in his own kitchen, realizing that the woman standing 6 feet away from him was not who he had filed her as in his internal architecture of the world. "I need you to explain to me," he said, "exactly what Hartwell's position is on the Caldwell deal." Evelyn set her coffee cup down. "The trust has significant concerns about the third-quarter liability structure in Caldwell's financials. Those concerns were formally documented and submitted to the review committee last week." "Last week," he said it flatly. "Before the dinner." "Yes." "So the entire dinner was a dinner," she said. "I didn't design it to be anything other than what it was. The timing of the review was determined by the committee's schedule, not by me." That was technically true. She had not manufactured the timing. She had, however, been aware of it for 17 days and had said nothing to Nathan about it, and they both understood, standing in this kitchen, that silence and action exist on the same spectrum when you have information someone else needs. Nathan pressed both hands flat on the counter. She noticed the same gesture she used, both palms flat grounding. She didn't know if he'd learned it from her or she from him. It didn't matter now. "You should have told me. You should have asked me," she said, "about Hartwell, about my role there. At any point in 3 years, Nathan, any point." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not recalibration this time and was not performance. It was pain. Genuine, unmanaged pain, the kind that surfaces when a person realizes not just that they were wrong, but the specific shape of what their wrongness cost. "I knew you were connected to the trust. I didn't know—" "You didn't ask," she said, again, quietly, simply. That's the whole sentence. From the living room, Clara's voice had gone lower. Whatever phone call she was on, it had taken on a more urgent quality. She was speaking faster, shorter sentences, the rhythm of someone receiving information that required rapid processing. Evelyn could not hear the words. She didn't need to. Nathan straightened, ran a hand through his hair. "I need to call Christine." "Christine will call you when she's ready," Evelyn said. "She's reviewing documentation this morning. I wouldn't expect a call before 11. He stared at her. "How do you know Christine's schedule?" "Because I spoke with Christine yesterday afternoon." The silence that followed that was a different kind of silence from any they had shared so far. It was the silence of a man discovering that an entire conversation, a parallel, significant, consequential conversation, had happened around him without his knowledge or participation. A conversation between his wife and his board chair, yesterday afternoon. While he was, she knew, in a pre-dinner briefing with Clara, rehearsing the talking points for a dinner that Evelyn had already, by that point, entirely reframed. "You spoke to Christine," he said. "Yes." "About the Hartwell assessment." "Among other things." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What other things?" Evelyn looked at her husband carefully. This was the question she had known would come, and she had thought about how to answer it for a long time. She had multiple versions prepared: the complete version, the partial version, the version that protected certain information for later use in the formal proceedings. She chose the version that was honest without being complete, because honesty was something she had committed to, and completeness was something the situation did not yet require. "I spoke to Christine about the governance structure at Grant Capital," she said, "specifically about the access levels and operational authority that have been extended to non-board, non-executive personnel over the past 18 months. Nathan went very still. Non-board, non-executive personnel. They both knew exactly who that phrase referred to. They both knew that this was no longer a conversation about the Caldwell acquisition. "Clara's role," he started. "Clara's role is not the issue," Evelyn said, "or not the only issue. The issue is the system. The way information flows inside your company, Nathan. The way decisions get made and who makes them and whose name is on the authorization when they do. Those are structural problems. They're not personal." She believed that. She had worked very hard to believe it, and on most days she succeeded. The personal component, the erosion of her marriage, the quiet daily humiliation of watching a woman progressively replace her presence in her husband's life, that was its own wound, its own reckoning. But in this conversation in this kitchen, she was not the wife. She was the chairperson, and the chairperson had structural concerns that were documented legitimate. And entirely separable from the question of whether her husband had feelings for his assistant, Nathan opened his mouth, closed it. He was doing the calculation she had expected him to do, the rapid mapping of what Evelyn knew versus what Christine knew versus what Marcus Webb knew versus what was in writing and what could still be managed and what could not. She watched him do it, did not interrupt it. Let him arrive at the conclusion on his own because that was faster than trying to take him there. When he arrived, she saw it happen, the slight deflation, the shoulders, the way the performance architecture that had been holding him upright for 20 years, finally in this kitchen, with no audience but his wife, let go of a small but critical piece of its structure. "How bad is it?" he said. And this question in this voice, stripped of everything he usually wrapped around himself, was the most honest thing he had said to her in 2 years. She considered her answer carefully. The Caldwell deal as currently structured will not receive Hartwell approval. That's definitive. The board made that determination this morning based on the documentation I submitted. She paused. Beyond that, the scope of the governance review depends on what the review surfaces. I can't give you a ceiling on that. You can't, or you won't. Both, she said honestly. He nodded slowly. The nod of a man accepting terms he doesn't like because he has finally understood he is not in a position to negotiate them. Then he said something she hadn't expected. He said, "Is this about Clara?" She looked at him for a long time. "This is about what you allowed, what you built, what you let happen inside your company and inside this marriage because it was convenient and you didn't want to look at it." She paused. "Clara is a symptom, Nathan. You are the system." The words landed, and she let them land, and she did not cushion them because they were the truest thing she had said in this entire conversation, and he needed to hear them without softening. From the living room, Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her composure was intact, but different in quality. Tighter, more deliberate. The composure of someone who has been on difficult phone calls for 40 minutes and is now recalibrating on the fly. She looked at Nathan first, then at Evelyn, and her read of the room was fast and accurate. She was smart. Evelyn had never underestimated her intelligence. The problem with Clara was never intelligence. The problem was that her intelligence operated entirely in service of her own expansion, and she had never once in 4 years considered that there might be a wall she couldn't see until she walked into it. "Nathan," Clara said, "I need 5 minutes." "Not now," Nathan said, and his voice was different too. Flatter, the voice of a man who was in the process of re-understanding something and didn't want his re-understanding interrupted. Clara looked at Evelyn, and for the first time the look was not warm, not managed, not the performative professional warmth she deployed like a tool. The look was direct, assessing. Two people who had been in a quiet, unacknowledged contest for a very long time, looking at each other without the usual screens in place. Clara said to Evelyn, "Whatever you submitted to the Hartwell board, I assume you understand the impact on the company, on the people who work there. It was a good move. Redirect from personal to institutional. Frame Evelyn as the aggressor. Put the welfare of unnamed employees between them as a shield. Clara was good at this." Evelyn said, "I understand the impact precisely. That's why the documentation was thorough. The deal collapsing doesn't just affect Nathan. The deal has structural problems that predate my assessment," Evelyn said. "I didn't create the liability in Caldwell's Q3 projections. I found it. There's a distinction." Clara's chin came up slightly. "And the timing. Submitting governance concerns the morning after a major investor dinner. You don't think that looks calculated?" "Clara," Nathan's voice, flat, warning. But Clara was not finished. 3 years of management, of smooth performance, of redirecting and recalibrating and controlling the narrative. Something in the morning's events had destabilized that mechanism, and what was coming through the gap was sharper, less managed, more real. "I've spent 4 years building this company alongside Nathan. 4 years of work that made every deal, every relationship, every piece of growth that Grant Capital has, and you walk into one dinner with a document and—" "Clara," Nathan again, harder this time. "She is dismantling something I helped build," Clara said, and her voice had cracked just slightly, just at the edge of it. Not performative, genuine, which made it in a strange way the most human Evelyn had ever seen her. Evelyn looked at Clara Voss, really looked at her, The way she looked at Nathan in the car with full clarity, with the willingness to see what was actually there, and what she saw was a 31-year-old woman who had worked very hard and crossed too many lines and told herself that the lines didn't exist because crossing them had always been rewarded. A woman who had confused proximity to power with possession of it, who had been allowed by a man with no boundaries to believe she was a partner when she was an employee, who had made choices that were wrong and was now beginning to understand the scope of what wrong meant. Evelyn said quietly, "You helped build something that had a serious flaw in its foundation, Clara. I didn't put the flaw there. Identifying it is not dismantling." The silence stretched. Clara looked at Nathan, and in that look was everything the 4 years, the proximity, the reliance, the complicated web of what had grown between them in the space Nathan had left open and Clara had moved into. The look of a person realizing that the person she had relied on is not going to protect her. Not now, not in this kitchen, not with his wife standing 3 feet away holding the most important institutional card in the room. Nathan looked at the counter. Clara straightened, picked up her tote bag, and said with the last of her professional composure reassembled around her like armor, "I'll be at the office. When you're ready to talk about the board call, Nathan, I'll be there." She walked out. The apartment door closed. The sound of it was very specific. Not a slam, just a closing. The quiet final sound of something ending. Nathan and Evelyn stood in the kitchen for a full minute without speaking. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. "It's Christine." "Take it," Evelyn said. He answered. She heard Christine Hale's voice crisp and measured from where she stood, not the words, just the tone of a board chair who has reviewed documentation and arrived at a position and is delivering it with the professional clarity of someone who has done this before. Nathan's face moved through several expressions in quick succession. He said yes twice, said I understand once, said nothing else for the better part of 3 minutes, which meant Christine was not asking questions. She was informing. When the call ended, he put the phone on the counter and stood with his hand on it for a moment, not looking at Evelyn. "They're initiating a formal governance review," he said. 30-day process. I'm expected to submit to an independent audit of executive decision-making authority over the past 2 years. He paused. Clara's access to board communications has been suspended pending review. Evelyn nodded. And the Caldwell acquisition is on hold indefinitely. Yes, she said. He turned and looked at her. And the expression on his face was not the one she had expected. She had expected anger, had prepared for it, had considered in the methodical way she considered everything the specific forms it might take, and how she would respond to each. But what was on his face was not anger. It was exhaustion. The specific bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has been performing his own story for so long that he has forgotten what the real version felt like, and who has just had the performance interrupted without warning, and has no understudy and no script for what comes next. "What do you want from this, Evelyn?" he said. "Really, what is the outcome you're building toward?" She had prepared for this question too. Had a clean institutional answer ready: the governance reforms, the structural accountability, the compliance framework. All of it true. All of it genuinely what the Hartwell board needed and what Grant Capital needed and what the Caldwell situation required. But he hadn't asked the chairperson. He had asked his wife, and his wife owed him a different answer. She said, "I wanted you to see me, Nathan. That's what I wanted. 3 years ago, that's what I wanted. I wanted you to see that I was in the room, that I had a voice, that I was your partner." She paused. Not for effect, because the next words were harder. "But you kept choosing not to look, and eventually I understood that the solution was not to be louder. The solution was to let the things I'd been quietly managing stop being managed, and to let you see what was underneath." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "And now what I want is accountability," she said. "For the company, for the people in it, for the process." She held his gaze. "What we want for our marriage, that's a different conversation, and it can wait until this one is finished." It was the most honest thing either of them had said in years. She watched it move through him, watched him decide in real time whether he was going to fight it or receive it, whether this was the moment he became the man who understood what he'd done, or the man who looked for someone else to blame. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said quietly, "I didn't see you. You're right, I didn't." He stopped, started again. "That doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know I understand what you're saying." It was not enough. They both knew it, but it was real. The first real thing in a very long time. At 11:23, David Rice called Evelyn. She excused herself to the study, closed the door, listened to David walk her through the first formal responses from Grant Capital's legal team, cautious preliminary buying time. She told him to proceed as planned. She told him that she expected Nathan's legal counsel to request a meeting within 48 hours. She told him that when that meeting was requested, she wanted the full documentation file ready. She put the phone down, sat in the quiet of the study for a moment. Then she opened her email and began drafting a memo to the Hartwell board, systematic, precise outlining the next 30 days of the review process in language that was unarguable because it was built entirely from facts. She had been writing for 20 minutes when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she recognized Marcus Webb's personal cell. It read, "Patricia and I spoke this morning. You should know we're with you on this, not just institutionally. M." She read it, set the phone down, looked at the wall for one moment, picked the phone back up, typed "Understood." "Thank you, Marcus." Sent it. Went back to the memo. At 12:41, Nathan knocked on the study door. She said, "Come in." He stood in the doorway and looked at her desk and said with the particular awkwardness of a man navigating entirely unmapped territory, "I think I need to call my own attorney." "Yes," she said. "I think you do." He nodded. Didn't move immediately. Said, "The company, the people who work there, David Cho, the analysts, the junior staff, they're not part of this." "They were never part of this," she said. "The review is structural, not punitive. The company survives this. Whether you survive it in the role you currently hold, that's a different question." He absorbed that, nodded again slower, and said something she didn't expect, something that cost him. She could see a significant portion of whatever was left of his constructed self-image. He said, "I'm sorry, Evelyn, for not looking." She held his gaze. Let the words exist in the room without immediately processing them, without immediately deciding what they meant, or what they cost, or what they were worth. Just let them be there, because some things, when they finally arrive, deserve the courtesy of a moment of silence before they're cataloged. Then she said, "I know." He left the doorway. She heard him on the phone in the bedroom, a new voice, different from the board call voice, the investor dinner voice, the carefully constructed voice of Nathan Grant performing Nathan Grant. This voice was quieter, more uncertain, the voice of a man starting a conversation he did not know the end of. She turned back to her memo. Outside, the city moved on with complete indifference to the thing that was collapsing inside this apartment. 12 floors down, people walked and bought coffee and argued and laughed and carried their lives forward without any awareness that up here in a study lined with the books and files and documentation of a woman who had spent 3 years preparing for this specific sequence of events, something enormous was quietly, finally, irrevocably breaking apart. Evelyn Grant finished her memo at 1:15, reviewed it once, found it clean, sent it. Then she sat back in her chair and allowed herself for the first time in 3 years a feeling she had not let herself have because it was premature and she could not afford premature feelings. The feeling was not triumph. It was not vindication, not satisfaction, not relief. It was the specific clarifying feeling of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, who has just set it down in the right place and who can now for the first time stand fully upright. She sat with it. Let it breathe. And then she opened the next email and went back to work. The formal governance review began on a Tuesday. By Wednesday afternoon, Grant Capital's internal communications had been subpoenaed by Hartwell Trust's legal team. Not dramatically, there was no raid, no public announcement, no moment of cinematic confrontation. Just a certified letter delivered to the company's registered legal address, signed for by the firm's general counsel, a man named Robert Fitch, who had been with Grant Capital since the beginning, and who called Nathan at 2:17 that afternoon with the specific controlled alarm of a lawyer delivering news he had hoped he would never have to deliver. Nathan was in his home office when the call came. Evelyn was in the study, 30 feet away, working through the Hartwell Board's response framework. She heard his voice shift, not the words, just the register, the particular tightening that she had learned over 7 years to read the way some people read weather. She did not go to him. This was not because she was indifferent. It was because she understood with the precision of someone who had thought this through in granular detail, that the kindest thing she could do for Nathan right now was to let him sit inside the full reality of his situation without her presence softening it. Softening was what had kept this going so long. The quiet accommodation, the private management, the decisions she had made year after year to absorb rather than escalate, to document rather than confront, to wait rather than act. All of it had been in some measure a form of softening, and the softening had cost them both more than the confrontation ever would have. Robert Fitch called back 40 minutes later. Evelyn heard Nathan's voice again. Shorter answers this time. The call lasted 6 minutes. At 4 o'clock, Nathan knocked on the study door. She said, "Come in." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the chair she kept for David Rice and occasional Hartwell colleagues. A good chair, solid, unpretentious, and he looked at her with an expression that had been stripped of virtually everything she had spent 7 years watching him perform. He said, "Robert says the subpoena covers internal messaging going back 24 months. Yes," she said. "That includes there are messages between me and Clara that I wouldn't want." He stopped, started again. "Some of those messages are personal, Evelyn." She looked at him steadily. "I know." He absorbed that. The fact that she knew. The fact that she was telling him she knew without elaborating on what she knew, which was in some ways more difficult than an accusation. An accusation gave you something to push against. This gave you nothing but the clean, silent weight of being fully seen. "How long have you known?" he said. "Long enough," she said. "Nathan, I'm not going to discuss the personal dimension of this today. The legal process will surface what it surfaces. What I can tell you is that the review is not designed to expose your private life. It's designed to assess governance structure. What appears incidentally—" She paused. "That's a consequence of how those lines were blurred, not something I engineered." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you believe that yourself? That you didn't engineer this?" It was the sharpest thing he had said to her in this entire week, sharp enough that she stopped and actually considered it, because he deserved a considered answer, and because she owed herself the honesty of examining the question rather than deflecting it. She said, "I built these conditions for the truth to surface. I chose the timing. I chose what documentation to prepare and who to share it with and when." She paused. "Whether that's engineering or accountability, I think that depends on whether what I surfaced was true." "And it is," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He nodded, slowly. The nod of a man who has arrived at the edge of something he cannot argue with. "Robert is recommending I engage outside counsel, someone not connected to the company's existing retainers. That's wise. He thinks the board may move toward a leadership transition." She said nothing. "Evelyn." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard in years, raw, unmanaged. "Is that what you want? For me to lose the company?" She looked at her husband, and she thought about the $40,000 from her family trust, the investor introductions, the Tuesday in March, the 22-minute car ride, the 7 years of dinners where she sat at the far end of the table and performed invisible while someone else performed indispensable. She thought about what the company had cost her, and what the company had cost him, and what they had both lost separately and together, in the slow dissolution of the thing they had once been building toward the same destination. She said, "I want the company to be what it should have been, clean, governed correctly, with appropriate structure and real accountability. Whether that happens with you at the center or without you, that's not my decision to make. It's the board's, and it should be." He looked at her for a long time, and then he said very quietly, "I didn't mean for it to become what it became." "I know," she said. And she did know. That was the most complicated part. Nathan was not a villain. He was a man who had been comfortable with his own version of events for so long that he had stopped checking it against reality. He had made choices that were wrong without ever pausing long enough to understand they were choices at all. The road between intention and impact is long and unmapped, and Nathan had never been a man who looked at the road. He had looked at the destination and assumed the road would take care of itself. "Nathan," she said, "go home. Talk to your attorney. Make the calls you need to make." She paused. "And when you're ready to have the other conversation, the one about us, I'll be here." He looked at her desk, at the organized stacks of documentation, the open laptop, the legal pads covered in her precise handwriting. He said, "You've been ready for a long time." "Yes," she said simply. He stood, straightened his jacket out of habit, the physical habit of reassembling himself before walking out a door, the same habit he'd had since the day they met, the same gesture that had once charmed her, and now simply reminded her how deep the performance went, how many layers it had, how long it had been the primary language of his existence. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, didn't turn around. He said, "She didn't mean anything. Clara, I need you to know that." Evelyn waited 1 beat, 2. Then, "She meant enough, Nathan. That's why it matters." He left. The apartment door closed at 4:49. She sat in the silence for exactly 4 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and called David Rice. The next 3 weeks moved with the specific velocity of institutional machinery in motion, fast in its consequences, deliberate in its process, unstoppable once correctly initiated. The governance review produced what the documentation had predicted it would produce. Clara's communication records revealed 17 instances of messages sent from Nathan's accounts that Nathan had not authorized, including 2 to members of the Hartwell Trust's investment committee that had directly affected the timing of previous deal reviews. The implication of those messages that someone at Grant Capital had been managing Hartwell's internal communications without Hartwell's knowledge was the single most significant finding of the review, and it landed with the weight of something that could not be reframed or managed or redirected. Clara's employment was terminated on day 11 of the review, not dramatically. A letter hand-delivered by Robert Fitch to her attorney citing specific violations of fiduciary responsibility and confidentiality protocols. Her keycard stopped working at midnight. Her email access was revoked. The company-issued phone was collected by HR the following morning. Evelyn heard about it from David Rice, not from Nathan. She received the news with the same stillness she received most things now, not because she felt nothing, but because she had long ago stopped confusing feeling with reaction. She felt something when she heard that Clara's access was gone. Something complicated, not triumph. Something closer to the particular exhaustion that arrives when you've been right about something for a long time, and being right turns out to feel exactly as heavy as being wrong. She thought about Clara in the kitchen that morning, her voice cracking, saying, "I helped build this." And she thought, yes, you did. That was the truth. Clara had worked hard and contributed real things. She had also systematically crossed lines that should not have been crossed, had mistaken access for ownership, had made choices that were harmful and wrong. Both things were true simultaneously. The world was full of people who built something real and broke something real at the same time. You could hold both. What you could not do was pretend the breaking hadn't happened, because the building was genuine. On day 19, the Grant Capital Board convened an emergency session. Evelyn was not in the room. She was not a Grant Capital Board member, and she had maintained careful separation between her Hartwell role and the internal board proceedings, because the integrity of the review depended on that separation being real, not just procedural. She waited in David Rice's office while the session ran 3 hours and 40 minutes, and she answered emails and reviewed the next round of Hartwell documentation and did not allow herself to watch the clock. David came in at 6:22, sat down, looked at her with the expression of a man delivering news he has anticipated but not enjoyed. He said, "They're asking Nathan to step down from the CEO position pending the completion of the independent audit. He retains his equity stake. He retains his board seat for now, though that may be revisited. Operational control transfers to Christine Hale on an interim basis." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "How did he take it?" "He's with his attorney," David said. "Robert told me he didn't fight it. He asked for 48 hours before it goes public." The board agreed. "Yes, the announcement goes out Thursday morning." She nodded, looked at her hands, said, "The company will be all right." David said, "Yes, I think it will." She drove home alone. walked through the apartment which had the particular quality of a space in transition, neither fully his nor fully hers, the shared and the separate existing in uncomfortable adjacency. Nathan had been staying in the apartment's second bedroom for the past week, an arrangement they had arrived at without formal discussion, the way certain arrangements in long marriages solidify without being explicitly agreed upon. Simply because both people understand that the alternative is a conversation neither is yet ready to have. She made tea, stood in the kitchen with the mug in both hands, and thought about the first night of their marriage, a small dinner in a restaurant in the West Village that Nathan had booked himself. He had been specific about booking it himself, had been proud of it, had wanted her to know that he had done the thing without assistance, that he was the kind of man who showed up for the details. She had loved him for that, had believed genuinely in the version of him that cared about details, had believed that a man who noticed a reservation was a man who would notice a person. She had been half right. The tea cooled in her hands. She set it down. Nathan appeared in the kitchen doorway at 8:30. He was in the clothes he'd worn to the board session jacket off now tie, loosened the particular dishevelment of a man who has been professionally formal all day and is now releasing the architecture of it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, "It's done." "I know," she said. David called. He moved to the counter, stood on the opposite side from her, which had become without discussion the geography of their conversations this week. "Christine will be good," he said. "She knows the company." "Yes, the staff will be fine. David Cho's team, the analysts, they'll be fine." He was reassuring himself as much as informing her. She understood that and let it happen. "The Caldwell deal is dead, but the portfolio without Caldwell is still solid. The company survives this." "I told you it would," she said. He looked at her. "You were right, about most of it." He paused. "About all of it, actually. He stopped, tried again. "I need more time to be able to say all of it clearly. But I know you were right." She nodded. He said, "What happens to us?" And there it was, the question that had been in the room since the car ride home from the Sterling Club, since the kitchen that first morning, since every conversation in between. The question that all the legal proceedings and governance reviews and board sessions had been living alongside unaddressed, like a second story happening simultaneously in a different room. Evelyn set her tea mug in the sink, turned to face him fully. This was the conversation she had also prepared for, also rehearsed, also revised 17 times in her mind, and like every conversation she had prepared for extensively, it arrived feeling nothing like the preparation. "I've spoken to an attorney," she said. "Not David, someone who handles family matters. I've asked for an initial consultation. I want you to know that before you hear it another way." Nathan's face didn't collapse. She had thought it might. It went still instead, the stillness of a man receiving a confirmation of something he had been afraid to confirm. "Divorce," he said, "not a question." "I don't know yet," she said. And that was honest. She genuinely did not know. She knew that the marriage as it had existed was over that version, the version with Clara in the kitchen and Nathan at the head of the table, and Evelyn at the far end performing invisible that version was categorically finished. But whether the marriage itself was finished, or whether there was something underneath the performance that was worth the extraordinary difficulty of excavating, that she did not yet know. "I know we can't continue what we've been doing. I know that whatever comes next has to be built on something real. Whether you and I are part of building that together, that's something I need time to understand." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Will you give me the chance to understand it with you?" It was the right question. She recognized it as the right question, not a plea for forgiveness, not a negotiation, not a performance of contrition designed to produce a specific outcome. Just a genuine question from a man who was for the first time in a very long time asking rather than assuming. She said, "I'll give you the chance to try. What you do with it, that's yours." He nodded. His hands were on the counter, and she could see even from across the kitchen that they were slightly unsteady, the hands of a man who had held things so tightly for so long that the act of releasing them had left him temporarily unsure of what his hands were for. She picked up her mug, rinsed it, set it in the drying rack. the ordinary grounding mechanics of an ordinary evening in a life that was not ordinary at all right now and would not be for some time. At 9:15, she went back to the study, opened her laptop, pulled up the draft framework she had been building for the past 10 days. Not a legal document, not a governance memo. Something different. A proposal. For a new initiative within the Hartwell Trust's operational scope, a corporate governance reform program designed to provide institutional support and structural guidance to mid-size companies navigating the specific failure modes that the Grant Capital situation had exposed. Blurred authority lines, inadequate documentation of decision-making chains, the particular corporate vulnerability that arose when personal and professional relationships were allowed to operate without structural separation. She had been thinking about this for weeks, not as a monument to what had happened, as a practical response to it. Because the problem was not Nathan Grant specifically. The problem was a pattern she had watched play out in rooms full of intelligent people who had simply never been required to look at the structures they were building until those structures failed. And if Hartwell Trust's 60 years of institutional authority could be directed at preventing that failure, at giving companies the framework they needed before the crisis arrived, rather than after, then something real could come from this. Something that lasted longer than the headline. She worked on the proposal until 11:40, refined the language, tightened the scope, made it something she could present to the board next month with confidence, with evidence, with the full weight of what she had witnessed and documented and understood. At 11:43, she saved it, closed the laptop, sat for a moment in the quiet of the study. On the desk in front of her was a small framed photograph. It had been there for 6 years, a picture from their 3rd anniversary, a trip to the coast of Maine that Nathan had planned entirely himself, and which had been genuinely one of the best weeks of her life. In the photograph, they were both laughing. Really laughing, the kind that doesn't know it's being photographed. Nathan with his arm around her shoulders, both of them slightly windburned, happy in the uncomplicated way that is only possible when you don't yet know what's coming. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she picked it up, opened the desk drawer, placed it inside, face up carefully, not hidden, but not displayed. Not gone, but not where it had been. Some things needed to be set down before you could understand what you wanted to do with them. 2 months later, the divorce papers were filed. Not acrimoniously, Evelyn had been specific with her attorney about the manner in which this would be conducted, had insisted on mediation over litigation, had made clear that her interest was in a clean and fair resolution that reflected the reality of their financial entanglement without manufacturing conflict where none was necessary. Nathan's attorney, to his credit, had matched that approach. The proceedings were difficult in the way that all honest reckoning is difficult, but they were not cruel. And they were not public, and they concluded in 6 weeks with an agreement that both parties signed without drama. Christine Hale formally assumed the CEO position of Grant Capital 3 weeks after the audit concluded. The audit had found what Evelyn's documentation had predicted: significant structural lapses, inadequate separation of personal and professional authority, and the 2 unauthorized communications to Hartwell that became the most consequential finding of the entire review. Nathan retained his equity and his board seat as promised. He was not ruined. The company was not destroyed, but he no longer ran it. The thing he had spent 20 years building existed without him at the center, and he had to learn at 51 what that felt like. From what David Rice told her, he was learning it slowly, and not always gracefully, but he was learning it. Clara Voss did not resurface publicly. There were industry whispers, there always were, but she had retained her own attorney, and the settlement of her termination had included an NDA that covered the specific conduct findings. Evelyn did not know where Clara went next. She had thought occasionally about the version of Clara's life that existed before Grant Capital, the ambition that had existed before. It found an open door and walked through it without examining what it was opening. She thought about the particular failure of being very good at something in service of the wrong thing. It was not she had decided her job to resolve that. It was Clara's. The Hartwell Trust's governance reform initiative launched 7 months after the dinner at the Sterling Club. Evelyn presented it to the board on a Wednesday morning in March, standing at the head of the table for the first time since she had taken the chair. She usually ran board meetings from a different position, a deliberate choice to redistribute the visual authority of the room, and she walked through the framework with the unhurried clarity of someone who had been building toward this specific presentation for a very long time. The board approved it unanimously. Marcus Webb seconded the motion. Patricia Gould, who had joined the Trust's advisory committee 2 months prior, gave her a nod across the table that carried the weight of the Sterling Club dinner and everything that had happened since, and the particular respect of one woman for another who had done a very hard thing very well. On the way out of the boardroom, Marcus caught up with her in the corridor, fell into step beside her, said without preamble, "I've been thinking about that dinner for 7 months." "So have I," she said. "You knew that night what was coming." "I knew the structure of it," she said, "not the specific moments." He was quiet for a few steps. Then, that young man's laugh, the one at the table, you heard it. She looked at him briefly. "Yes." "And you held it together." "I held it together," she said. He nodded slowly. "That's the hardest thing," he said. "Not the strategy, not the documentation, the holding it together." "Yes," she said, "it is." They reached the elevator. He pressed the button, looked at her with the direct, unvarnished gaze of someone who had been in the world long enough to recognize the real thing when he stood next to it. He said, "What comes next for you?" Evelyn Grant looked at the elevator doors, thought about the proposal she had just presented, thought about the empty study at home and the drawer where the photograph rested face up in the dark. Thought about the woman who had arrived at 6:40 and retreated to the powder room to compose herself, and the woman she was right now standing in a corridor after presenting a framework that would change how institutions like this one protected people like her. She said, "Something I build myself this time, from the beginning." The elevator arrived. She stepped in, turned to face forward. The doors closed. And Evelyn Grant, who had spent 7 years being the most important person in every room she was in without anyone noticing, and who had spent 3 years making sure that when the truth finally arrived, it would be so thoroughly documented and so structurally irreversible that no amount of charm or management or narrative control could redirect it, stood in the elevator going up and allowed herself fully and without reservation the quiet, clean, unperformable feeling of a woman who had finished one chapter and was ready at last to write her own. She had never needed anyone to see her build it. She had only needed to build it, and she had,